everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of season 5, all about natural dyes. And today we're going to be talking about the ways that we can find those dyes. But first, here's what's happening on the farm. So I'm recording this mid April. Oh my gosh, my wisteria is just going wild. You just walk outside and it's just full of perfume and the beautiful blossoms. I just love it. The guy that comes in does our garden and mows our lawn. He hates my wisteria, but I love it. And yeah, it does get a little bit out of hand, especially in the summertime after the blossoms are gone. And, it sends out all these tendrils and the stuff that I have to keep cut back. But oh my gosh, this time of year, it is just so beautiful and worth it. And I just love it. Um, we we had Emily, our shearer and good friend, brought a whole bunch of baby goats. I think they're mostly milking goats, and they're all females, and there's 40 of them, and it's that like they are out there chomping down the grass. It's really wonderful. We don't have enough animals to eat down all of our grass, and I don't want to be out there, using gasoline or my time to be out there mowing. And so it's really great to have someone who can bring their animals down and eat our really nutritious grass, and so we're really really happy about that. And that's what's happening on the farm. So with natural dyes, there's a bunch of different ways that you can attain them, and the one that is really the most probably the most accessible is using the raw materials themselves. So you can forage them, you can plant them, you can also buy flowers and various other raw materials through dye houses as well. So you can harvest the wood if you have a tree that comes down in the neighborhood, or a branch that comes down. You can always harvest that and use that. You can also do a lot of different planting marigolds and indigo and sunflowers and Dyer's coreopsis and even madder. I would say if you're interested in using madder and you're thinking about dyeing it, put it in a pot, I think. A rather large pot, but it is invasive. We planted it in raised beds, and it has it's hard. It didn't really. They're not really jumping the beds because they're going underneath. It's going underneath into the dirt and up on the other side. And it's not the most particularly beautiful plant when it's growing. And what you use on madder is the roots, and you have to let it grow for at least 2 years, if not more, before you have roots of any size that will give you some color. So that's my caveat with madder. Grow it in a pot if you really want to grow it. So when you're using raw materials, whether they're flowers or leaves or parts of the wood or the husks of black walnuts or the husks of hickory nuts, you usually need a weight of 1 to 1. So if you're dyeing just one skein of yarn, which is usually a 4-ounce skein, you're going to need about 4 ounces of dye stuff. And that's a lot. So if you're going to be planting, plant a lot. That's my suggestion for you. Plant a lot. If you are thinking about growing marigolds, get a lot. So when you have the raw materials, you will put those into water and kind of make a tea out of them. So I usually heat them gently for about an hour, and then I let them sit overnight. And it will release the dye into the water, and then you can use that to dye your yarn or fabric. It's best to put loose dye stuffs into some kind of a mesh bag. And what I have used for that is there are bags that you can get for making nut milks on Amazon or any other place like that. And it has it's a very fine mesh, so nothing goes through it except for the whatever gets dissolved in the water. Or if you don't want to get the mesh bags, then what you need to do is strain the liquid away from the dye stuffs using some kind of a sieve. Now you can use those teas and keep those teas on hand and use them later. Or you can use them repeatedly, getting lighter and lighter colors each time you dye from them, which we call doing an exhaust dye. And you can also take those exhaust dyes and combine them together. For instance, you could take a marigold exhaust and you can combine it with a madder exhaust and get a really nice kind of like salmony coral color, which would be really, really pretty. It's going to be lighter. It's going to be more pastel because you're using the exhausted dyes. And you just keep using them until until you can't tell that it's doing any dyeing at all. And then the beauty also of this is that any of those dye stuffs that you collected that you used for the tea that are in those bags or that you strain out, that can just go in your compost pile. So it really is a zero waste kind of a situation. That water, the tea that you have made that becomes your dye stock, again, you can go and put that out on your in your vegetable beds, or in your flower garden, and use that as kind of gray water, and it will do great for you. So just a word about the amounts of dye to use. So natural dyeing and dyeing in general really is kind of scientific. You do need to do some math if you want. But it's also very much an art, especially when you're talking about natural dyeing, because the flowers that I grow this season are going to have probably a totally different, growing experience next season. So each year you're going to have different amounts of dye, different amounts of flowers that you can harvest. There's going to be good years, there's going to be bad years. They're always going to be a little bit different. And that's where having the art of natural dyeing comes in, where you can, add a little something of this, add a little something of that, kind of like you're cooking, kind of like you're having a conversation with the pot and deciding, what do I want to add to this to make this a color that is more pleasing for me. But if for the science part of it, this is what you need to do. All of the dye houses, they will give you some information about DOS, which is depth of shade. That's basically how light or how dark you want it. Typically, I'll look at what the dye house is telling me. I'll always go for the medium depth of shade, and then I will know that from there, I can go lighter and lighter by using those exhaust pots if I want to. So the depth of shade will give you the kind of the percentage of WOF. So WOF is weight of fiber. That means you need to know what the weight of your dried fiber is going to be. Is that going to be a piece of fabric? Is that going to be a skein of yarn or several skeins of yarn? You need to have that weight. And then you're going to multiply the weight by the percent to find out how much dye that you need to use. For instance, cochineal extract can be very, very concentrated. So in one recipe, they will say you need 0.2% weight of fiber. So I'm going to do one skein in my example here, which is 4 ounces, but you really need to do it in grams because I have a gram scale. So, and grams are easier to measure out more exactly. So 4 ounces is about 113 grams. So then you're going to multiply, you're going to change that percent into a decimal. So it's 0.002 multiplied by 113 grams, and you're going to need to have 0.23 grams of cochineal to get that medium depth of shade for that one skein. You could always find that that math. It's all over the internet. You don't have to memorize it. You can write it down, though. You can put it someplace special. It's pretty easy. And that's just, again, that is a rule of thumb. That is a place to start. It doesn't have to be the end all and be all. Again, this is where your creativity comes in. It's where the art of being a natural dyer or a dyer in general comes into play. So let's talk about extracts. Extracts are made and sold by dye houses, by dye companies, and there's several very good dye houses that are in the U.S. and also in sorry, my phone just rang. That are also in Canada, and they use fair trade practices. They use sustainable practices, that kind of thing. So they're very good. And basically, an extract is they're taking the raw dye stuffs. They're making the tea for you out of those dye stuffs, and then evaporating all the water out of it to make it into a powder. So it's highly, highly concentrated powder. And then you're going to use that powder. You're going to measure out the weight, just like I talked about. You're going to mix it back in with water and then dye with them. So typically, you're going to use a whole lot less of the dye stuff in an extract form than you would if it was in the raw form, because you have made it into, you've taken whatever it was, 1,000,000 marigold heads, and you've made a tea out of it. You've evaporated it down, and now maybe, and I'm just exaggerating and extrapolating, and maybe it makes a pound of powder for you to use in dyeing. And typically you use a whole lot less of the dye stuff to the weight of fiber, 1%, 2%, or like in the example of cochineal, like 0.2%, something like that. And each company's extracts are also going to be a little bit different. So use the information that comes with the purchase from that particular company, so that you know how much to use for your dye pot. And I would also say that year to year, again, you're going to have slight differences in how much needs to be used, what kind of color you may get, because of the growing conditions. And as we know, growing conditions all over the world are kind of changing. And some years they're good, and some years they're not so good. So, just pay attention to that when you're buying from a dye house. There are some extracts that can't be evaporated all the way to powder. They become more, they have more resin in them. Typically, those would be extracts that come from a wood source. For instance, fustic is this way. Osage Orange can be this way. And they're going to come more like a kind of a pudding kind of consistency. But you're going to use it the same way. You're going to measure out the weight that you need of the dye for the weight of your fiber. And you're going to dilute it with water. You're going to heat it, and you're going to dye with it. Now, some companies are now doing liquid extracts. So these are just like using dye stocks. They're already suspended in the liquid. And again, because these are proprietary formulas, you need to use the instructions that the company has on how much dye to use for how much yarn or fabric. I can tell you that recently I've been purchasing a few of these: logwood, madder, Saxon blue, which is a kind of indigo, pomegranate, and the amount that they say to use for a medium color on my yarn, it's a pretty dark color. So I'm finding that if I use their recipe, I have a lot of dye exhaust that I can use over and over again Or if I just, or when I make the next pot, I'm going to remember, oh, don't put that much in. Like use half of what they're saying because it was just too much. It was too dark. Um, Again, when you have these dyes that you've used once or twice, you can keep using the exhaust dye pot as much as you want until you reach a color that you're not happy with. And yes, you can combine them. You can take a Saxon blue liquid extract, and you can mix it with a um, a pomegranate, and you might get a really interesting kind of a green color. So just like you would with an acid dye, you can mix two dyes together to get a different color. So here's my highlight. My natural dye highlight is on Osage Orange this episode. I love these trees. They are planted all over the United States, and I can't speak to other countries. I just don't know. But I do know that they were planted around a lot of farms and ranches because they're quick growing and they provide excellent windbreaks. So you will, a lot of times you'll find them all planted in a row, on the edge of a pasture or something like that. What I love most about them, they produce this green fruit, which I don't think you can dye with. I have to say, I've never tried dyeing with it. I think I should. Then when they come out again, when they're ripe again, I will try a dye experiment with them. But mostly they're kind of a lime green on the outside, but they're white on the inside. So I'm not sure that they have very much color in them. But what I love about that green fruit is that it has a really interesting floral scent. And I like putting them in bowls and using them as the air fresheners. Plus, I think they're kind of cool looking. They're kind of, they're spherical and they're the size of maybe a softball. And they have all this texture on the outside, and they're just they smell so good. So the dye comes from the wood. And so to access the dye that's in the wood, it needs to be shaved or made into sawdust or something like that. Typically how I've used it is, getting with a woodworker who is making objects out of those trees that have been pruned or the trees have been cut down or whatever like that. And we can get the sawdust from that person and make it into a tea. If you're using something with the sawdust, or you could probably shave it like with a plane or two, and that would probably work. Remember, put it in the mesh bag. Ask me how I know. I did have a lapse in memory, a lapse in judgment the last time that we did some dyeing with wood shavings. Just made the tea, didn't strain it, and put the yarn in. And I have to tell you, it took me hours to get the little pieces of sawdust out of the yarn. It was a total nightmare. So don't do that. Use my example. So the dye is beautiful. It is a bright, clear yellow, like a sun yellow. It's really very beautiful. And again, you can get that beautiful sun yellow in your first pot. Then you can do an exhaust pot and get a lighter kind of a butter yellow. And then you could even go down and maybe get an ecru or something like that. Or you can, mix it with other exhausts that you might have to make a whole different color, like using madder or something like that. It's a really versatile color. And like I said, if you have them in your neighborhood, check out those fruits because they really do smell great. My farm yarn highlight of this episode is our Yearling Mohair. This yarn is really a fun yarn. It is a fingering weight. It is highly, highly lustrous. I would say that it's a 2-ply, and I would say that it's a relaxed 2-ply. It doesn't have It isn't plied real hard, which is great for mohair. If a mohair yarn is plied too hard, you will get a scratchy yarn. Again, ask me how I know. I know this from experience when I've had mills overspin my yarn. So this is mohair that also comes from younger goats. So there's somewhere in the range of like age 2 to age 4. They still have very, very nice mohair, soft mohair, and it is nice and strong as well. This yarn you can dye up into spectacular colors because it takes dye so well, number one, and number two, it's so highly lustrous that it just looks like it's reflecting back on you. It's just a beautiful yarn. I will say that when you knit with it, you should use a stitch that does have a bit of structure to it. Mohair does not have a lot of elasticity, and this is 100% mohair. So if you are going to do a lace or something that has a lot of yarn overs in it, something like that, you may find that your garment will start to sag and get bigger, and you probably don't want that to happen. So I would say, making something that has cables, or making something that has a really interesting, knit purl kind of structure, a linen stitch or a basket weave stitch, something like that, that will have enough structure. A basket weave would be so cool because you would have the light reflecting in different ways. Oh my gosh, I should try that. That would be really cool. And you'd get some of that with the linen stitch, but not as much because you're only talking about, one strand. Whereas if you did something kind of like basket weave, you have an inch, maybe inches going different ways, an intralock kind of a thing, kind of a look. So that would be my caveat about using the yearling mohair, is just to make sure you have a stitch that has a bit of structure so that you aren't disappointed with that. So I hope you enjoyed this delving into more of natural dyes, how they come into being, how you can find them, and how you can use them. And until next time, happy making.